I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Heads Up for Wednesday the 29th of April. John Stewart will have last call for you today from 4. To communications, a bidding war has broken out across the Tasman for Australia's third largest ISP and one that has been in hot water over piracy. M2 Group, which recently bought Call Plus for $250 million, has placed a cash and shares bid of Australian $1.85 billion for iiNet, trumping a $1.5 billion cash offer from TPG. iiNet shares have jumped close to 20% since the bidding war began, valuing the company at 1.6 billion Australian. M2 Group, which has been growing rapidly through acquisition over the past 2 years, has a market cap of 2 billion Australian. If M2 and iiNet do come together, they will have a combined 1.7 million broadband customers, making the merged entity Australia's second largest ISP. iiNet has traditionally been close to Orcon. The two companies partnered on the development of the Genius phone for internet calling. The two companies also share a bit of a reputation for pushing the envelope for disruptive technologies and services. Call Plus is currently the target of a High Court action brought by TVNZ, MediaWorks, Sky TV and Spark over its global mode service. Across the Tasman, iiNet and Dodo have been embroiled in the so-called Dallas Buyers Club case over whether internet service providers are required to cough up IP addresses of customers who have allegedly downloaded pirated movies. A federal court judge rules they must. iiNet and M2 have decided not to appeal. iiNet was also at the centre of a landmark 2012 case brought by Roadshow over whether ISPs are liable for infringing content. Roadshow lost. Like M2, iiNet has grown through acquisition. In 2010, it bought the retail arm of Australian telco AAPT from Spark in a $60 million deal. In 2013, Telecom pocketed $450 million Australian, selling AAPT's wholesale business to iiNet's rival in its current deal, TPG. Let's talk Hanover. The Financial Markets Authority is playing down secret settlement talks taking place between Mark Hodgson and the regulator. In the case launched about 3 years ago, the FMA wants compensation for the $35 million investors lost. The proceedings against Mr. Hodgson and Hanover co-founder Eric Watson and former directors Greg Muir, Bruce Gordon, Sir Tiffany O'Regan and Dennis Broit over allegedly misleading or untrue statements made in offer documents during the period December 7, 2007 to July 22, 2008. Yesterday, the parties met for a judicial settlement conference before Justice Sarah Katz in the High Court at Auckland. The hearing was in chambers, meaning the media could not report. An FMA spokesman said it was a standard step in the litigation process and could not comment further as it was before the courts. In March, a related proceeding which Mr. Hodgson had taken against trustees to include them in the case was part settled. Mr. Hodgson reached a confidential settlement with Perpetual Trust, leaving only Guardian Trust a party to the case, which went to the Supreme Court. A decision in that case has been reserved.
In news from the courts, the company director at the centre of serious fraud office charges of bribery totalling more than $1 million says he's astounded by the allegations, which he calls offensive. On Tuesday, Stephen James Borlase, 50, Barry Kenneth James George, 68, and one other person who has name suppression appeared in the North Shore District Court to face charges of corruption and bribery of an official. No pleas were taken. The SFO alleges bribery of more than $1 million involving previous employees of Auckland Transport and Rodney District Council. It says Mr. George and an unnamed associate received undisclosed payments or gratuities from Progens Limited director Mr. Borlase, who supplied both Auckland Transport and Rodney District Council, while the pair were working in engineering and management roles. But Mr. Borlase has today hit back at the claims, which he strongly denies. The alleged gratuities include cash, travel, accommodation and entertainment given between 2005 and 2013. Mr. Borlase, however, says he's confident the success of his business is only due to hard work, professionalism, and because we are a good ethical corporate. He says he was astounded when the issues were first raised by the SFO, but has fully cooperated with its investigations. The SFO allegations say a culture was created in the Road Maintenance Division where the acceptance of gratuities was normal. Mr. Borlase says, Not only do I deny the claims, I am completely confident that no inappropriate or unlawful payment has been made by my company. All the marketing budget for the company has been lawful, open and fully accounted for. Mr. Borlase says he considers it normal business practice for a company to foster good relationships through marketing, but this never included any express or implied insistence on any kickback or contract award. I find this suggestion offensive. Mr. Borlase is an engineer with 25 years' experience, with this being the first time his business has ever been questioned. He has stood down from Progens pending the result of the case and declined to apply for name suppression. He says, "I hope the business community takes a keen interest in this concerning case, as I consider my company's behaviour and business practices to be common and widespread, and have long been accepted as normal and lawful. I consider that I have nothing to hide or to be ashamed of." The 3 defendants have been remanded on bail until May the 18th. And that story from Hamish McNichol.
NBR Radio. With the Property Press. It's out now to show you around.
I'm Grant Walker with Heads Up. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. The first post-ponytail poll. There's a surprise, but not what you might think. Call Plus makes a bid for iNet. GNS points the finger over air pollution, and if you live in Christchurch, this is something you want to hear. Xero shares continue their decline. Kirk's reports a half-year loss. Orion Health gains traction. Lundy to appeal, and property investors beware. The budget is coming to get you. If you're travelling today, Auckland wet and windy, possibly thunder. Wellington mainly fine but windy. Christchurch windy but fine. And Dunedin a few showers later. To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. To the environment. A report commissioned by Environment Canterbury confirms some of the findings about air quality by Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright. It comes as the closing date looms next week for public submissions on ECAN's draconian proposed new air plan. ECAN last year embarked on zealous policing involving staff snooping with thermal cameras outside homes where burners are registered as being more than 15 years old. ECAN claims it's following government national standards, which Ms Wright has also criticised and says need overhauling. The almost $35,000 report by GNS Science confirms Ms Wright's conclusions that half the air pollution measured by ECAN was actually dirt, sea spray, diesel and petrol vehicles. The other half was attributed to log burners. In the past, ECAN has claimed more than 80% of pollution was attributable to log burners. An earlier GNS report says Auckland's measured pollution was mostly sea spray, followed by diesel engines. Meanwhile, Ms Wright says that overall air quality in New Zealand is a good news story. There has been a 75% reduction in airborne particles in Auckland over the past 50 years. Recently, City Council has abandoned a proposal to ban open fires and pre-2005 wood burners in Auckland. Similar progress has been made in all other towns and cities. The most important of 4 World Health Organization guidelines is for long-term exposure to PM2.5, the most dangerous fine particles, with 2 measures for long-term and short-term exposure. But the New Zealand guideline is for short-term exposure to PM10, larger airborne particles measuring less than 1/100th of a millimetre, also with 2 measures for long and short-term exposure. The New Zealand pass rate under these guidelines was 87% for long-term exposure and 50% for short-term. Ms Wright says the national standard should be reviewed and brought up to date, with current scientific understanding taking more account of the dangerous fine PM2.5 particles. She also highlights the atmospheric inversion layers that trap smoky air in cooler climates in places like Alexandra near Queenstown and Christchurch, which show spikes in pollution of varying duration during winter. Ms Wright says national standard pass failure rates for daily exposure limits should be re-examined. For example, some centres could experience long-term poor air quality just below the failure threshold, or the opposite. To a 2015 budget update, a further step up in activity by Inland Revenue against property investors appears to be on the way. Finance Minister Bill English says there is ongoing work on the existing Income Tax Act rules, which mean people who buy property with the intention to sell at a profit have the increase in value classed as part of their income for that year and are taxed accordingly. NBR Radio understands no final decisions have yet been made, but increased funding is under consideration. The rules have been in the Income Tax Act since at least 1956, but were only sporadically enforced and somewhat erratically interrupted by the courts. In 2007, however, the then Labour government provided the IRD with an extra $14.6 million over 3 years, specifically to enforce this part of the Income Tax Act. When that funding expired in 2010, the current national government not only gave the IRD another $14.6 million to enforce this law, but doubled it to $26.6 million over 4 years, or $6.65 million a year. In last year's budget, when that funding expired, Mr English rolled it over, made it a permanent part of the IRD's baseline budget and increased it slightly. His comments yesterday suggest the IRD might get an extra dollop of funding when he delivers Budget 2015 on May the 21st. The extra funding has paid off in the most recent full year to June 2014. The $6.65 million spent on enforcing reaped $56.65 million in tax. It's worth noting that for all the extra enforcement, there have been no test cases. Those caught have paid up, albeit in some cases after arguing their position before the Taxation Review Authority. The government has clearly decided it's a door it can keep pushing, given there's been no litigation-driven pushback. The issue is not just about tax revenue. Concern about house prices in Auckland rising 20% in 1 year means policymakers, including the Reserve Bank, are concerned about excessive investment in that sector unbalancing the economy. Reserve Bank Deputy Governor Grant Spencer 2 weeks ago hit the headlines with a speech in which he argued the government has to look at all factors driving the Auckland property market, including the large capital gains being made by investors. That was widely and wrongly interpreted as a call for a capital gains tax. But there's more than one way to skin a cat, and it appears likely the government will step up tax enforcement activity using the existing rules.
In shareholder news, management changes and stock exchange rule breaches have meant yet another bumpy ride for governance software developer Diligent board member services, which may hope groundswell from its upcoming new product launch mollifies increasingly irritated shareholders. About 40 shareholders who attended the Diligent annual meeting in Auckland on Tuesday were updated on new product progress and introduced to fresh Chief Executive Brian Stafford 4 weeks into the job. The fast-talking American tossed around superlatives like unbelievable and tremendous, but shareholders understandably remained wary given the company's recent track record. Diligent has had a turbulent couple of years, facing protracted issues with option grants, account restating, and management and board changes. In 2013, it paid $15,000 to the financial markets watchdog for a series of listing rule breaches, including failing to file required information, failing to seek authorization for director payments, and incorrectly issuing shares and options to employees. Last year, it was fined $100,000 by the New Zealand Markets Disciplinary Tribunal for failing to file 3 earnings reports on time after incorrectly recognising revenue, forcing it to restate accounts for the 2010 through 2013 financial years. Then, early this month, the company announced Mark Weldon, the former NZX chief executive, had resigned as a director, leaving the company in breach of NZX listing rules until they find another. An irate investor said, "It's disgraceful a director would leave when the company has serious breaches during the year, and now this has left the company in breach again." He wondered whether Mr. Weldon had a good reason for leaving, or whether he just decided he was better off with TV3. Those at the meeting heard Mr. Weldon handed in his notice in August last year, yet a replacement had not filled his boots nearly 9 months later. Executive Vice Chairman Greg Peterson told NBR Radio after the meeting the board had taken the appointment seriously and would probably announce a replacement next week. And that story from Callida Smiley.
NBR Radio with Grant Thornton. Contact us to unlock your potential for growth.
I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Heads Up for Wednesday the 29th of April. John Stewart will have last call for you today from 4. To Mr Key's Saudi Arabia trip. The PM, John Key, has copped criticism for his trip to Saudi Arabia because of the country's poor human rights practices, which include beheadings and women being lashed for the crime of being raped. Mr Key has argued, however, that more interaction with Saudi Arabia may mean New Zealand is able to bring more influence to bear on such matters. He said, I think if we get a free trade agreement, for instance, with Saudi Arabia, we have got a much stronger relationship from which we can talk about a range of issues. The primary reason for Mr Key's visit, the first by a New Zealand Prime Minister, was to try to convince Saudi Arabia to back a free trade agreement between Gulf Cooperation Council member countries and New Zealand. Saudi Arabia has up to this point opposed such a deal. Post-visit, Mr Key has noted he can't categorically say that means we'll get the free trade agreement over the line, although sitting back in New Zealand certainly won't get us over the line. Mr Key had been urged to raise concerns about women's rights in Saudi Arabia, as well as wider human rights abuses. He said he hadn't been able to specifically discuss the former issues, but did raise the latter when he met with the country's ruler. Just shy of two-thirds of subscribers, in fact 65% participating in a poll on the topic, are comfortable with Mr Key's approach and agree New Zealand should do trade deals with countries with poor human rights practices, while 35% believe such agreements shouldn't be struck. Business. Kirkcaldy and Staines turned a first-half loss as sales fell and the Wellington department store operator wrote down a deferred tax asset. The loss was $501,000 in the 6 months ended February 28 from a profit of $563,000 a year earlier, the Wellington-based retailer said in a statement. Total revenue fell to $17.5 million from $19.4 million as retail sales declined 0.6% to $16.9 million and rental income fell to $553,000 from $2.4 million. The retailer said it's still working through options for returning the net $16.8 million from the sale of its Harbour City Centre building after repaying $23.5 million in bank debt. The company said any distribution to shareholders continues to be influenced by the retail operations results and by the timing of the receipt of the final instalment from the sale of the HCC. The company said the strategic review of retail operations likewise continues and remains the main focus of the board for the coming months. The board of the company decided that while it's considering options for the business, it should not make a permanent chief executive appointment to replace John Milford and has named Philip Schul as acting chief executive. The shares last traded at $168 and have declined from a high of $249 in May last year.
In news from the courts, former media agency owner Glenda Wynyard has indicated she'll appeal a home detention sentence. Last month, the Media Council founder was found guilty of 11 Crimes Act charges laid by the Serious Fraud Office following a 5-week trial, and convicted. The SFO says in a release Wynyard was sentenced to 8 months of home detention in the Auckland District Court. The charges had included causing loss by deception, theft by a person in a special relationship, and dishonestly using a document. Wynyard had redirected payments that were due to her accredited agency Aegis to repay a debt under an invoice factoring facility. She also presented cheques she knew would not be honoured and provided false and misleading information to the Print Media Accreditation Authority in order to gain accreditation. Wynyard, who had been living in Australia since 2011, indicated she will be filing an appeal. She's been granted bail and the sentence has been suspended pending the appeal. And that story from Victoria Young.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
Many workers around the world feel their incomes are worth less than in the past, and they aren't sharing in the benefits of growing economies. One reason is that incomes are taxed more as wages rise. In his Editor's Insight today, Neville Gibson examines what's known as the tax wedge. Neville, what is a tax wedge?
Well, essentially the tax wedge is the tax on labour as opposed to taxes on capital. It measures the full costs to an employer of a worker. It includes income tax, of course, but also other taxes such as for health or social security, but we don't have those in New Zealand. Each year the OECD, which is a kind of government think tank for 30-odd countries, prepares an annual survey called Taxing Wages, and it's found that the trend for most countries has been upward. In fact, between 2009 and 2014, it's gone up nearly 1 percentage point for a single worker without any increase in tax rates. And that's because of phenomena such as bracket creep, where benefits or tax rates don't move with inflation. And if you get a pay rise, you get into a higher tax band. So essentially the tax wedge is a measure of your take-home pay once all the adjustments for tax and other payments have been taken into account.
So what's the average tax wedge for these OECD nations?
Well, actually, it's a pretty impressive 36%, or just over a third. And this is marginally up over a year for the 32 countries in the survey. The average tax burden in 2010 was 35%, so that's pretty high. The survey also covers countries such as China, Indonesia, India, Brazil and South Africa that aren't really members of the OECD. And the survey shows that 23 of the OECD member countries didn't increase their marginal tax rates at all.
So how do New Zealand workers fare?
Well, the short answer to that question is better than anyone would expect if you listen to a lot of complaints about the unions and so on. In fact, the tax wedge in New Zealand is the lowest of 34 countries in the survey, and that was for single-earning married couple with 2 children. The survey actually does several case studies, but mostly they're for single people and for married couples with 2 children, but with one of the spouses not working. In fact, New Zealand's the most generous in the OECD with child-related benefits and tax provisions, and that reduces the tax wedge, as it's called, right down to just 3.8% compared with the OECD average of 14.8%. The reason it's so low is that we pay a high degree of income tax, whereas we don't pay any extra taxes, and then working for families reduces that tax burden in the latest survey by up to 13 percentage points. And for single workers without dependents, New Zealand is the third lowest. Only Chile is better than us. Actually, it's only second. Chile is lower. But in those sort of countries, you tend not to have very high social security taxes.
Indeed. So just looking at the New Zealand figures, does this mean Kiwis are paying less income tax than they were?
Well, not really. It means that what our income tax is the full amount of taxes we're paid. We're not faced with these extra burdens for health or social security. They're all wound into it, as happens with a lot of countries with welfare states. And then a lot of that is clawed back for those on low incomes through working for families. And so it means when you add the figures up that a take-home pay is actually for the single worker, after all the benefits and taxes are taken into account, you get about 96% of your gross wage compared with the OECD average of around about 85%. This also means that the next tax cost to employers is pretty low in New Zealand. There's no payroll taxes, no extra taxes. It all goes in one single tax.
Is the situation better across the Tasman?
Well, there they have payroll taxes, and while the wages are much higher across the Tasman, the tax wedge is also higher in percentage terms. So for single workers, it's 27.7% compared with the OECD average of 36%. And for a single earning family with 2 children, because there are benefits in Australia for those, it drops down to 17.5%. The trend has been downward in Australia from 2000, but if you look back just over the past 5 years, it's actually risen by nearly 1 percentage point. I'm not quite sure why that is, but overall Australia's got pretty low taxes by tax wedge standards. In fact, they have the 7th lowest for single workers and the 6th lowest for one-earner families with 2 children.
Well, what sort of comparisons are there with other countries, comparisons with New Zealand?
Well, these are awesome, I've got to say. In Belgium, 55, nearly 56% of your income goes in a tax wedge, so that's more than half. Germany's the next worst, just under half at 49.3, and Hungary with 49. This is because a lot of these people are paying for social security and other charges. And for the average worker and one-earner families with 2 children, the tax wedge is highest in Greece, where they've abolished a lot of these benefits because of the financial crisis. But also Belgium's pretty high up there with 40%, and France at 40% also. So they don't get a lot back in the way of benefits when you net it out. These austerity policies, in fact, had the biggest impact on Ireland, though, where they reduced both the family income supplements and the benefits were frozen. That resulted in the one-earner families with children paying a full 1.5% more in tax in 2014.
Interesting figures. Well, we'll wrap it up there, but thanks for your editor's insight today, Neville.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett. Open for breakfast, lunch and dinner and everything in between. NBR Radio.
I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Heads Up for Wednesday the 29th of April. John Stewart will have last call for you today from 4. While you were sleeping, stocks on Wall Street rose slightly as a number of positive quarterly earnings reports helped offset a continued decline in the biotechnology sector. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 39 points or 0.2%. The S&P 500 gained 0.1%. The Nasdaq Composite added a fraction to 5,060. Apple shares slipped despite a 33% jump in second quarter profit to US $13.57 billion after selling 61.2 million iPhones, up 40% on a year earlier. The Nasdaq Biotechnology Index fell 0.7% and is down 4.7% already this week after outpacing broader market gains this year. After last Friday, it was up about 20% for the year. European stocks fell as some patchy corporate earnings encouraged investors to pull back from a market that has rallied sharply this year. The Stoxx Europe 600 closed 1.5% lower, but is still up 18.6% for the year. Healthcare stocks on the index led declines, falling 2.5%. in response to Monday's steep decline in US biotech stocks. Germany's DAX fell 1.9%, France's CAC lost 1.8%, and UK's FTSE slipped 1%. In Asia, China shares fell sharply after the securities regulator issued a fresh warning to investors on the market's risks, while in Australia, weakness in mining shares pushed the benchmark further away from the 6,000 mark. The Shanghai Composite Index closed 1.1% lower, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index finished flat. Australia's S&P ASX 200 ended down 0.6%. Oil prices pretty flat, retreating from earlier gains on news Iranian warships had seized a US cargo ship. Back to the markets. New Zealand is emerging as one of the preferred property markets for global investors. This is a key finding in Collier International's Capital Markets report, showing prime average commercial, retail and industrial yields in Auckland and Wellington are higher than their global counterparts. Collier's International National Research Manager Chris Dibble says the world's largest investment funds are now more than ever adopting a strategy of investing in New Zealand commercial real estate. He says while New Zealanders typically provide the lion's share of buying activity, the motivations of offshore investors searching for higher returns and asset diversification in a world with low interest rates and strong competition have changed the investor landscape. Almost half the total value of properties sold for $5 million or more last year was sold to offshore investors. This accounted for 1/5 of all transactions. To the latest political poll, John Key and National are steady in the first post-ponytail poll, a result that may make opposition parties reassess plans to hammer the PM over the controversy when he returns to Parliament. A Herald Digipoll taken half before the news broke and half after shows John Key's preferred Prime Minister rating at 64.6, that's falling from 65 in December. Andrew Little at 13.9, up 0.3. And here's the big one, Winston Peters at 12, up 6.1%. Mr. Peters' bounce in personal support on the back of the Northland by-election was the poll's only major turn-up. Party support, National 51, up 0.6. Labour down 0.2 at 28.7. The Greens 10.8, that's up 1.3. New Zealand First 6.1, up half a point. Maori Party 0.8, down 0.7. United Future unchanged at nothing. ACT 0.8. Mana Internet 0 and Conservatives at 1.1. The random phone poll had a sample of 750 and was conducted between April 17 and April 26.
NBR Radio with Fuji Xerox, offering your business a whole new dimension with their 3D printers. NBR Radio.
I'm Grant Walker with Heads Up. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. The first post-ponytail poll. There's a surprise, but not what you might think. Call Plus makes a bid for iNet. GNS points the finger over air pollution, and if you live in Christchurch, this is something you want to hear. Xero shares continue their decline. Kirk's reports a half-year loss. Orion Health gains traction. Lundy to appeal, and property investors beware. The budget is coming to get you. If you're travelling today, Auckland wet and windy, possibly thunder. Wellington mainly fine but windy. Christchurch windy but fine. And Dunedin a few showers later. To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. Court news. Convicted double murderer Mark Lundy will appeal his most recent conviction for the brutal killing of his wife and 7-year-old daughter in late August 2000. On April the 1st, Lundy was found guilty for the second time of murdering wife Christine and daughter Amber, who were found bludgeoned to death in their Palmerston North home. Lundy was found guilty of the crime for the first time in 2002 and spent 12 years in prison before the Privy Council quashed that conviction in 2013 and ordered a new trial. He was found guilty of both murders for the second time after a 7-week trial at Wellington's High Court. The jury returned a unanimous verdict on both counts, and his life sentence was reinstated with a 20-year non-parole period. Lundy's lawyer, Julianne Kincaid, confirmed yesterday that an appeal on her client's behalf against sentence and conviction will be lodged with the Court of Appeal. She said it's not appropriate to rehearse in any detail in a public forum the grounds of the appeal, but it can be said that the issues raised will include a consideration of the mRNA molecules that convey genetic information evidence. To the share market, shares of Xero have dropped to the lowest level since the cloud-based accounting software firm announced its $147.2 million capital raising in February, as investors digest its full-year result and the sudden departure of another US-based executive. On Friday, the Wellington-based company said its annual loss increased to $69.5 million in the year ended March 31st, from $35.5 million a year earlier, as its increased spending on product development, sales and marketing for future growth offset a rise in sales. Revenue increased 78% to $127.2 million, while operating expenses jumped 96% to $167 million. It also announced its US-based Chief Financial Officer, Douglas Jeffries, has left the company after only 2 months in the role. Mark Lister, head of private wealth research at Craig's Investment Partners, said top-line revenue was probably where people expected it to be, but profit margins were down because costs went up more quickly than people expected. When you lose a CFO, and he's only been there for a pretty short time, the market was never going to take an announcement like that well. The software developer is foregoing profit as it chases 1 million global customers and is targeting growth in the US market, where it sees the potential to take market share of an estimated 29 million small to medium-sized business owners. The company's share price has been on a roller coaster ride, climbing as high as $45.99 in March last year, before dropping to a low of $15 in October as investors weighed Xero's cash burn and its US growth aspirations. Yesterday, the shares dropped as low as $20. The stock climbed from the $15 mark in February to as high as $26.49 in March, when the company raised $147.2 million from US-based tech investors. On Friday, the company said it had $268.9 million of cash available after its March cash injection to fund future growth and expansion. Grant Williamson, director at Hamilton Hinden Green, said there was a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction to see that price spike after the capital raise in March. The share price, he said, has now started to drift off. The momentum is certainly back on the downside. The result we saw last week has done nothing to improve the share price in the short term. Xero said US-based Mr. Jeffries is leaving to pursue other opportunities, while previous CFO Ross Jenkins will resume the role until a replacement is found. Mr. Jeffries' sudden departure follows that of Xero's North American chief executive Peter Karpus, who left the business in September, just 6 months after joining. At the time, Chief Executive Rod Drury said it was because Karpus's skills were mismatched to the company's needs at the time, as it sought to build presence in the crucial US market. Both Lister and Williamson said the sudden departure of senior executives spooked US investors. Mr. Williamson said, "I come back to the CFO resignation as well. That doesn't help confidence in the stock." To the markets, Orion Health says its deal flow for new customers is back to historic levels after a lull in the third quarter, and the company is looking to its new products to drive further sales. However, the healthcare management software developer says potential customers such as big paying insurance companies are seeking greater assurance around data security following recent high-profile data breaches in the US. Chief Operating Officer Graham Wilson said on an analyst's call from the release of Orion's fourth quarter cash flow update that this is adding complexity to Orion's sales cycle and extending the time it takes to close on deals. Orion says it's experiencing strong market procurement activity and has recently secured a contract with a strategic customer in the US and a large project in Canada. But Mr. Wilson noted the length of the sales cycle has been extended in some instances due to industry concerns around security. Recent data breaches involving Anthem Blue Cross Insurance and Premera Blue Cross in the US illustrated the industry's need to keep personal health more secure. Mr. Wilson said, so prospective customers are wanting to ensure we're using the very latest technologies and we have robust industrial strength solutions which are, as best as they are able to be, secure from attempts of penetration. That adds a little more complexity to the sales cycle and adds to the duration. Last month's cyber attack on Anthem ranked among the largest data breaches in US corporate history, with information on tens of millions of Anthem customers stolen. In response to a follow-up question from NBR Radio, an Orion spokeswoman says internet security is an ongoing consideration for all businesses, and Orion Health has always prioritised the security of data. The recent security breaches have focused customers' attention on security even more, and we have had to demonstrate our security measures and increased due diligence. We continually do penetration testing and have a team of encryption security specialists who oversee this. She added that the increased focus on security represents an opportunity for Orion. Our systems are well regarded, and the increased layers of security required act as a barrier to entry for new participants.
NBR Radio. With 2 Degrees, New Zealand's smartest business people are switching to 2 Degrees.
To the wine industry, sort of. Kiwi wine exporters are set to debut the best of the country's orange wine at the world's biggest festival in Slovenia. Orange wines are made in a similar way to many reds, with a longer period of maceration of crushed grape skins and seeds. Salmanazar, an export collective which sends wine from an elite group of New Zealand producers to Europe and North America, will be presenting a selection at the festival this month. More than 80 wineries from Slovenia, Croatia, Italy, Austria, Serbia and New Zealand will be present at the fair, the biggest and one of the only in the world dedicated to orange wine. Despite the name, the wine is not actually orange in colour, and the skin-fermented wines range from bright gold to a browner colour. Company founder Gabrielle Simmers says her company will be presenting a selection of skin-fermented or orange wines at the fair, including Green Glow, sort of Sauvignon Blanc, and Spook Light Pinot Gris from Supernatural Wine Co. and Pyramid Valley Vineyards Growers Collection Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, Gewürztraminer. She says the fair coincides with International Sauvignon Blanc Day. Not that we need an excuse to showcase the unique Green Glow. More producers, she says, in New Zealand are experimenting with skin fermentation of white grapes each year, and we're privileged to be showing one of New Zealand's first orange wines in one of its traditional homes, Slovenia. To the environment. A report commissioned by Environment Canterbury confirms some of the findings about air quality by Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright. It comes as the closing date looms next week for public submissions on ECAN's draconian proposed new air plan. ECAN last year embarked on zealous policing involving staff snooping with thermal cameras outside homes where burners are registered as being more than 15 years old. ECAN claims it's following government national standards, which Ms Wright has also criticised and says need overhauling. The almost $35,000 report by GNS Science confirms Ms Wright's conclusions that half the air pollution measured by ECAN was actually dirt, sea spray, diesel and petrol vehicles. The other half was attributed to log burners. In the past, ECAN has claimed more than 80% of pollution was attributable to log burners. An earlier GNS report says Auckland's measured pollution was mostly sea spray, followed by diesel engines. Meanwhile, Ms Wright says that overall air quality in New Zealand is a good news story. There has been a 75% reduction in airborne particles in Auckland over the past 50 years. Recently, City Council has abandoned a proposal to ban open fires and pre-2005 wood burners in Auckland. Similar progress has been made in all other towns and cities. The most important of 4 World Health Organization guidelines is for long-term exposure to PM2.5, the most dangerous fine particles, with 2 measures for long-term and short-term exposure. But the New Zealand guideline is for short-term exposure to PM10, larger airborne particles measuring less than 1/100th of a millimetre, also with 2 measures for long and short-term exposure. The New Zealand pass rate under these guidelines was 87% for long-term exposure and 50% for short-term. Ms. Wright says the national standard should be reviewed and brought up to date, with current scientific understanding taking more account of the dangerous fine PM2.5 particles. She also highlights the atmospheric inversion layers that trap smoky air in cooler climates in places like Alexandra near Queenstown and Christchurch, which show spikes in pollution of varying duration during winter. Ms. Wright says national standard pass failure rates for daily exposure limits should be re-examined. For example, some centres could experience long-term poor air quality just below the failure threshold, or the opposite.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.